So last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Tim Schellberg, and Tim is the president of Gordon Thomas Honeywell Government Affairs, and he's he's the president of a global consulting firm, leading nationwide policies in terms of DNA forensic databasing. And for the last 22 years, Tim and his firm have become the world's foremost experts on forensic DNA database legislation, public policy, and law. And Tim has advised over 50 foreign and state governments on DNA database legislation, laws, and policies. I can vouch for this because I've known Tim for many, many, many years. We've had many journeys together throughout the world, and he has helped me lobby in South Africa, the government, to pass our forensic DNA database laws, helped me to understand the importance of them. He is always on the move in various administrations throughout the world. I'm sure today he's going to be flying, or tomorrow somewhere else, to help another administration. His knowledge is immense. And I often say to Tim, you know, you're actually a humanitarian. And he goes, no, I'm not. I'm a consultant. I'm a global policy. But you're actually not. You really do change lives, Tim. You've certainly helped in South Africa change so many lives. You're so passionate. You're so dedicated. You're so committed. You're so knowledgeable. You look a bit like an American rock star, you have to admit. And it's wonderful to have you in this session, talk about your experiences, share them with us throughout the world. So it's lovely to get a global perspective. And thank you for coming all the way from Seattle in the USA to present to us today. So thank you very much.
Got it. Well, thank you, Vanessa, for that great welcome. And it's nice to be here in Kenya, in this beautiful country. First time for me. And the hospitality has been wonderful. So, and I'm amazed that nearly everyone is still here in the room at the end of the day for this last talk of your symposium. So as Vanessa mentioned, we work around the world to assist governments with the policy side of DNA databasing and legislation that you need to put this into place. So we provide the information, the data, the stories that you need to advance this policy. And everybody in this room, of course, is thinking about, at the end of the day, we're talking about DNA databasing for criminal offenders. Earlier in the day, you talked about it for missing people, which is very, very important. But my talk is going to focus on the criminal offender database side that allows you to really effectively fight crime. And you all want to do this, or you're thinking of the ways to do this, but really, it's not just you, because in the end, to have an effective criminal DNA database, you need the politicians. And the politicians need to vote on this legislation to allow you to create this database. Do we have a microphone? I think one of the previous speakers doesn't. I like to walk around as well. So you need to take this information of how to pass these legislation and the value proposition behind it and the policies, and float it up to your politicians, because without them, you can't move forward. And you need them to decide how successful these databases will be, because they're the ones that will tell you, can you put everybody convicted of any crime in the database? Can you put arrestees in the database? They're going to decide how successful these databases are. So it's important that you keep educating these politicians on the value of the database, so they have the value proposition to move forward. And you also need to convince them that it's not just a piece of legislation they're advancing forward. This legislation actually affects lives. As you saw from Ashley's case earlier today, if the state of California Parliament, the state legislature, we call them in the States, decided not to include arrestees in the database, Ashley's case might not have ever been solved. So it's important that they understand what they're doing is actually having a significant impact on many, many different lives throughout the world. So DNA databases, as we know them today for criminal offenders, is clearly the police force's greatest weapon. It is the most effective, most wonderful crime-solving tool that we know out there. And governments put them in place for basically 4 major public policy reasons. One, they solve crime, they prevent crime, they exonerate, and they actually can save government money. And so we're going to walk through a few of these individually. First of all, we know they solve a lot of crime. And you'll hear today in this presentation, if you do research on all these databases throughout the world, you'll see how successful they are. Just some numbers from the United States and the United Kingdom. In the US, a country of 300 million people, we have 20 million criminal offenders that are now have had buccal swabs taken and put into our database. And those criminal offenders have matched to 480,000 crime scenes that may not have ever been solved if it wasn't for the criminal offender databases that our state legislatures put in place through legislation. United Kingdom, even more impressive, a country only about 20% the size of the United States, has 6 million criminal offenders in their database. And they even have more hits than the United States at 750,000 hits in these databases for crimes that might not have been solved without the database, which was required by the legislation. Now, the biggest thing to think about when you're passing this legislation is your Congress or your parliaments might say, oh, we'll just put the sex offenders in the database. But if you only put sex offenders in your database, your hit rate, meaning you go to the crime scene, you have no idea who did it, and you plop it in the database, you're only likely way less of 5%, probably more like 2%. So it's important that they start thinking bigger, not just sex offenses and violent offenses to go in the database. If you put just sex offenders and violent offenses in your database, your hit rate might be about 10%. But if you start putting property crimes in the database too, maybe your hit rate goes to 20%. If you're all crimes, everybody convicted of most crimes, maybe with the exception of minor type of crime, your hit rate can climb up to 45%. Or if, like the United Kingdom, like South Africa, like New Zealand, like many countries throughout the world, you include everybody arrested as well as convicted of crime, you can actually get upwards of 60%. So again, usually the Congresses and parliaments make the decision of who goes in. And it's important for you to advise them that if you only put the lower level criminals in, you're not going to get many hits. So you want to take full advantage of the database by having the policy decision to put everybody in as much as you can. Now, this is a slide from the state of Virginia that we often show. They showed why you want to put violent or property crimes in the database. If Virginia only put, they would have lost 80% of all their hits if they only put violent criminals in their database, because what they found out is the people that were committing burglaries and car thefts move on in their criminal career to cause rape and homicides. And that's what this slide represents. Now, these databases also prevent a lot of crime, right? We've talked about this, the previous speakers, on how this does that, because when you have a big database that hits at a high percentage, you're taking these people off the streets so they can't cause more crime. And I learned this the first time in a story in Brazil when they were looking at their DNA database law. And I always tell this story of this particular criminal. In 2006, the Brazilian Congress had a legislation before them to propose a DNA database. And the legislators there, the members of parliament, said no. They voted no because they thought it was a violation of human rights to collect DNA to put in this criminal database. But in 2008, this individual was released from prison. And because the Congress said no, his DNA was not taken. He went to central Brazil and he murdered 5 women, all 1 month apart, leaving DNA at every crime scene. So what does that mean? That means that 4 of those women would still be alive if the Congress would have voted yes in 2006. And we actually know who these 5 women are. This is Edna, and she would have unfortunately died because she was the first victim. But we know that Anna would still be alive, as would Maria, as would Natalia, as would Edna, right? And these families, when they figured out that the fate of their mothers and daughters rested on the hands of the Congress to pass the legislation, they became very angry. And they went down to Brazil, they lobbied the president, the Senate, and they got that bill passed so it wouldn't happen to other families. All right, so that shows you why you need to have the database in place so you can prevent crime. The databases, we also heard previous speakers talk about this, exonerate a lot of innocent people, because when you have these high hit rates of finding people quickly, what does that mean too? It means that the police aren't investigating the innocent people because you can get the DNA in the database, get a hit, and therefore leave the innocent people alone. You don't have to question them, sometimes arrest them. And we know well in the United States, we've actually convicted a lot of people that were later exonerated through DNA as well. So that's the third public policy objective. And then finally, these databases actually save money. We know that it has a very strong deterrent value now. There's a recent study that said that people that were in the databases versus out of the database, the ones that were in their first year out of prison, they're 42% less likely to commit a crime than somebody that was convicted of the same crime that didn't go in the database. So you can imagine that prevents a lot of crime. We also know through previous studies that it has a huge reduction in crime. That every time you increase your database by 10%, the murder rate in the United States goes down 5%, 6% for sexual assaults, and 8% for car thefts. It's just some examples. So that can save money. And then there was also studies showing that there's a huge cost associated with crime that the database could prevent. In fact, they calculated that every time the US puts in one database sample into the database, it actually saves the US government $20,000 because of the deterrent value and the cost of crime upon victimization, healthcare services, things like this. So the value of the DNA databases caused the United Kingdom to be the first country in 1995 to actually pass the law and put it into place. And they did this knowing that they would have this high deterrent effect, that their hit rate would be very high. So they invested in it. And I put the United Kingdom up there and the date of 1995, because this shows you that this has been in place now for 27 years. And many countries' laws programs have been in place for a long time. And that's good for countries like Kenya and others that are putting in their database now, because you have all the previous experiences from these countries to be able to move forward. And just a quick slide about, again, the value of the UK system: 6.5 million offenders and criminal offenders, 650,000 caseworks, all these hits with their hit rate that they declared last year at 66%. So it's climbing even higher than 60%, which is an amazing number. United States, I mentioned, we have all 20 million offenders. The good thing is that they have this high because of Dr. Badoli and everybody that came after him in the US FBI that set the program up. There's all these standards and protocols and operating procedures that you can borrow from. The FBI publishes these that the countries can use to help them. I think William said earlier that the technology is easy, which it is. The hard part is the programmatic side and the operations side. But with all these countries doing this before and the US government having all this standards in place for you to use, it becomes a lot easier. I throw this up here just to show you that even the US compared to the UK doesn't really compare. The UK, because they include everybody arrested for a crime in the database, and it's been matured over the last 20 some years, their hit rate's at 60%. The US, everybody convicted's in the database, and maybe half of our states have some arrestees in. Our hit rates average is about 45%. So UK is solving a lot more crime per capita compared to the US because they've taken that extra policy step with their parliament to put everybody arrested in the crime into the database. So the US, the UK, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, they were the early adopters of DNA databasing. And with that data, they helped many other countries move forward over the years. And in fact, as of today, 59 countries have passed legislation requiring a certain category of criminal offender to go into the database and have implemented that on somewhat of a national scale, if not a full national scale. And here are the 59 countries that have passed the legislation and have implemented it on somewhat of a national scale or national scale. And from these 59 countries, we now estimate that we have about 150 million criminal offenders by law that have gone into these 59 country different databases. And as you can see, South Africa is the only one that's been implemented on a national scale in Africa. But from what I'm hearing here today, with the interest of Kenya and what I heard from Tanzania earlier and Uganda, there's going to be many other countries joining this list in the near future. One of the biggest policy issues you have to think about when you're putting in these databases is the privacy issues. And we heard some of this earlier as well. You know that we have great benefits to society from these 4 public policy things that I talked about of why it's important. But you have to balance that out with privacy, because taking people's DNA does impact your privacy at some level. But that can all be overcome because of the value to society to have these if you can just control for the privacy violation, right? But I'm going to tell you first, there's really not much of a privacy violation with criminal DNA databases, because this is all that goes into the database. In fact, this is a colleague of Ashley's, Jan Sepich DNA code, which is, who cares if anybody has this? What are they going to do with it, right? What would if somebody hacks the system and gets your DNA code, what would they do with those numbers? Nothing, because they don't mean anything other than distinguishing me from you. However, it's important that we keep it private and we set up systems around it. So I'm just showing you that this privacy concern can be overcome. Okay. So what we need to overcome, though, is your members of parliament and congresses and legislatures around the world thinking that what really is going into these databases is your whole genome, but it's not. It is not. It is just those little numbers. All right. So you need to educate the policymakers to realize your genome's not going in there. It's just these numbers. Okay. It's more like a fingerprint. However, the problem you got to overcome is, yes, only those numbers are going in the database, but what the government still has is what? Your sample, right? And what can you do with that sample if you wanted to? Violate people's privacy, right? You could test it for healthcare things. You could do all these things, and that's a problem. But one of the policy solutions we've recommended over the years to deal with that problem is what? Destroy the sample after you profile it, because then the public has public confidence that you're not going to violate their privacy. And that's the strategy we've recommended. And in fact, 17 of the 59 countries now have that provision, including the United Kingdom, that says once you test it, goes up in the database, destroy the biological sample, you're making your public happier that way, and they don't start worrying about it of a privacy violation. There's also all the other privacy violations we talked about, protecting the data. You could have criminal penalties if it's misused. It never is. And 150 million profiles around the world. I've never once heard of anybody misusing those samples around the world, but you need to gain that public confidence and put the privacy protections in place so people have confidence in your program. A few more minutes. I'm going to close with a couple thoughts. One is the DNA Hit of the Year. Anybody here in the room heard of DNA Hit of the Year program? All right. Some of those people. Okay. This is a program that we put on at Gordon Thomas Honeywell where we invite cases from around the world to submit to an international panel of judges to review cases where they're using the DNA database. And it's a great program because it brings recognition to the police, the crime labs, the prosecutors, everybody that's using DNA databases to solve and prevent crime. It brings awareness to the countries that have yet to move forward with DNA databasing, and it creates a path for action for the countries that haven't moved forward yet. And with these cases, you can just kind of get a sense of what's going on in the world with DNA databasing. You also get a sense of some of the policy issues that you have to think through through the cases, the real life cases that are being submitted. Give you an example, there's some cases this last couple of years where a lot of YSTR cases, where countries are not only setting up autosomal STR databases from convicted offenders and arrested offenders, but they're setting up Ys. So if you don't hit on the autosomal, you can go to the Y and see if you get a match, not to the criminal, but perhaps to some family member that allows you to research the case. And through those, seeing how those cases work, you could start to understand the policy issues you have to put in place to make sure that public trust with the database occurs. Next, I'm just going to close with a quick discussion about rapid DNA. This was brought up a little bit earlier of what rapid DNA is. And of course, it's basically, you know, of these 59 countries around the world that have DNA database programs, they all use the CE workflow, right? And it goes into the lab, it's done by scientists, it takes multiple steps, and it takes quite a while to get through the process. But with rapid DNA, you take that CE workflow in the lab and you cram it into a box. It's about the size of a office printer. And it can be done in 90 minutes, and it doesn't have to be done by a scientist. Now, Rapid DNA does not take the place of the laboratory workflow because rapid DNA cannot do really complex things. You wouldn't want to do that anyway. You'd want that to be done by lab, by professionals that can interpret the data, but rapid DNA has a place. And just to give you some of the applications that are being taken place throughout the world with rapid DNA, an example out of France. So France has these island territories throughout the world, right? And they can't afford to put in a full laboratories in these small islands. So they're putting rapid, French government is putting rapid on the islands. And they're basically the rapids being used for both the reference samples for their database and simple casework, right? So blood, saliva, cigarette butts, chewing gum, things like that, they can all go in the rapid. And that's better than not having a DNA database at all. So that's an application for rapid. In other places, United States, soon to be in London and other places, they're using rapid in the police station for countries that allow for arrestees. They come in, they get their picture, they get their fingerprints, they also get swabbed. The police officer puts it in the machine while they're processing the paperwork. They'll know in 90 minutes before they release that person out in the community before their court date, whether or not they're wanted for some unsolved crime. And that's another application. And finally, throughout the world, they're using rapid for investigative leads, right? A police officer comes to a crime scene, it's got single source DNA, they collect 2 swabs, right? Some blood from the crime scene. One they'll hold and go to the laboratory if they need it, but the other one they could take back to the police station, run it in 90 minutes and get an investigative lead. And then when they arrest that person, it goes to court, they can use that other sample to go to the lab and use that in court. So those are some of the applications. I think what's interesting for Africa is the French example in the island territories, because, and I think another previous speaker mentioned this, there's circumstances here where many countries in Africa could never build a laboratory like you have here. And they might need, so why not have a rapid to at least get them started with something? I think Dr. Badoli mentioned this as well through one of the questions. So, and of course with rapid, there's also policy issues that you have to figure out and think through, like in the regular workflow. But it's a great technology that's coming that I think will be integrated throughout the world as we're starting to see that now. So with that, I think we're about out of time. So hopefully I've given you a flavor of what some of the issues you have to think through when you're developing your database. And again, thank you for having me and appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tim. And come on, Africa, let's get another DNA hit of the year from our communities into this amazing competition. It highlights the work that we do. I know South Africa, I think we came 3rd in one of the years. And I really look forward to seeing some more contributions from countries within Africa to your program, because it's really exciting. You should follow it in any event because they're fabulous cases. Tim, thank you so much. Any questions for Tim? Yes, we have one. Thank you.
My question to Tim is how many samples are processed in that 90 minutes?
Well, it depends. I think you could, the one or as many as devices you have, you can do, but yeah, it's per cartridge, it's 1.
Okay.
Yeah.
So per day, if you have many criminals, how many will you process? You will need to have many machines.
Yeah. For what I showed you, yes, right.
The idea is really to use it in conjunction sometimes with an infrastructure. There's a real need for it, certainly for when you want rapid cases, if there's a high profile case. Often like in South Africa, you've got a backlog and you just need a much quicker response. When you've got a disaster, we use it for DVI, for disaster victim identification, when you need to have, you would need to identify bodies quickly. So it has a very specific purpose, but as Tim was saying, in other countries where you can maybe use, for instance, I know Malawi are looking to Zambia to help with their infrastructure, but having a rapid DNA system there so that at least they can do some cases when they need to do cases. So it's an application that you need to work in conjunction with building an infrastructure.
Exactly.
Yep. Thank you.
Any other questions for Tim? Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you so much. And thank you. Thank you so much. Sure. sure, guys. Yes, let's give them a round of applause.